Good evening. So I guess what I said about there not being, like math involved with the book of Numbers didn't get anybody else to show up. It's my normal Sunday night crowd, so. What's really great is that you guys don't get a chance to see it when I say stuff like that, because maybe you might see the person sitting next to you or whatever, but I get to see all your faces when I say that kind of stuff. It's pretty funny. If people are tuning in and they didn't hear Book of Numbers, I told everybody, you guys were probably all here, but I said that people don't want to come and study the Book of Numbers because they're not good at math. It's like, that's not what the book's about. That's just, to me, it's funny. If you guys don't find that funny, it says probably more about me than it does you. Oh, goodness. Chapter 14 of the Book of Numbers. And this is, I got to tell you, it is an incredibly fascinating chapter. Incredibly so. It does such a great job of explaining to us a few things, because this is, you really think about this. This is when God has them go spy out the land, as we saw at the close of chapter 13. So, if they had done what they were supposed to do, they could enter the land. There's nothing preventing them from doing it. And if you think about it, the bad report was really because of a lack of belief, a lack of faith, and a lack of trust, and that it brought about a bad report. Now, again, the things that we looked at of their report, I don't know that it was necessarily inaccurate, but it was probably embellished. And then mix that with the typical fear of man, and you have 10 of the 12 spies. We're going to see what happens with them. Not only do they give a bad report, but they are going to be punished for that bad report. And how God ends up dealing with them is a fascinating, fascinating thing to behold. Chapter 15, kind of interesting because we'll get into it, is an immediate departure, and it's God's way of saying, all right, I'm going to deal with all the people that just had their little episode in chapter 13 and 14. Chapter 15, he speaks right past that and says, now the rest of you, when you get to the land. And so we'll find out the whole 40 years. How many of you guys read ahead to find out where the 40 years was because you just couldn't take it? Okay. You couldn't wait 2 weeks when I said it like 2 weeks ago. We're going to find out. So you may have read ahead, so you know why it is. And it is kind of an interesting thing because you think of this whole idea of 40 days. Now, before we get started, 40 days. You will see 40 days, whether it is 40 days like we think Noah, 40 days of them spying out the land, 40 years, 40 days of Jesus's, temptation in the wilderness and all that stuff. And so this recurring thing of 40 days, it shows how we are. Now there are they've made 40 days of all kinds of things into a cottage industry in our modern days. So there's 40 days of doing this and 40 days of doing that. And they write books about it and make a whole bunch of money. And goodness, why do we do such things? How about we just stay with the Word? But be that as it may, that's a topic for a whole nother night. Oh, by the way, this coming week, Thursday, I fly out for Kansas City and a conference that runs through Saturday. So I'll be there Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and I ask, please be praying for us. There'll be a few of us that are heading up there. I know that Paul and Ruth Smith are going to be going up, and I believe they're just going to be there to fellowship with us, and that would be great. But my good friend Charlie Flores from Calvary Chapel of Texas, El Paso, and Xavier Reese from Pasadena. We all get a chance to speak on a few things at a conference, and very much looking forward to it. I'm not sure about all the live streaming. Maybe I can find that out for you guys Wednesday and see if they're live streaming it. But we appreciate getting a chance to go and do conferences and whatnot. And they're topically they're important. So it's the idea of equipping the church. So anyway, with all that said, chapter 14, and remembering what you're going to see in this, just some overview things. As I had said, it's really the report that comes back. It's so obvious, the ones, bless you, that are worried about the circumstances and they make excuses, versus the two that come back and say, yeah, it is what it is, but God told us to go, so let's go. That's a pretty cool thing. And so we see how God will deal with them. But we also want to recognize that for those that fall into a place of unbelief, God pretty much condemns them. And for the people who walk with him by faith, he rewards those. That's pretty important for us to remember even in this day. So the way that people were dealt with for their disobedience was much different in those times, as you will see. But we should still remember it's the same God. We just happen to be in what we would call an age where grace is what's ordinarily shown to us. So hugely important. Chapter 14, let's have a word of prayer. Father, as we come to you this evening, we are once again, as always, dependent upon the work of your Holy Spirit to make the words that we read understandable to our hearts and minds. And so we depend upon that leading and the guidance of your Holy Spirit as we come to your word. May we be people who hear and make proper application to what it is that we read. May we learn from these things that were examples, as we read this morning, as Paul would look at them, calling them examples written for our admonition. May we be people who lay hold of the promises you make. We thank you and we give you all praise in Jesus' name. Amen? All right, so chapter 13 kind of closes with they've gone in and they've spied out the land, and the report comes back. And so we know what Joshua and Caleb have to say about this. And now here's the second part of it, because here's how God's going to deal with how the people responded to what was the report. Now remember, they go in, they check the whole thing out. They say, pretty much, this is the summation of it. The report comes back. The land is everything that he promised. It's fantastic. Problem is, there's some really bad guys in there. And it wipes out its inhabitants. Remember all that kind of stuff. And Joshua and Caleb said, yeah, I guess so. You can go along with that, my rendition. But what do we care? God said go in. He's the one who's given it to us. So they're his problem. They're not our problem. We call that faith. They believe. And so they trust God above circumstance. Very important. And, I guess you would say that's basic, ground level Christianity right there. We don't have to know all of the details. All we need to know is what God promised and that he's able. So we walk accordingly because of that, right? That's just kind of basic Christianity 101. Okay. These were not Christians. This was Old Testament. Jesus has not come in. And yet it is the same God who makes promises. And to this point, you can actually say there are so many times God could have failed them, but he has never failed them. So why would they ever fall into any kind of unbelief? It doesn't make sense, does it? And yet here they are. Well, chapter 14 says, so all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. Now, it's probably good, and without commentary, let me just read verses 26 to 33 of chapter 13. Why would they cry? Why did they weep? Let's remind ourselves from 2 weeks ago. So they departed, they came back from Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness at Paran and at Kadesh, and they brought back word to them and all of the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. So this is when the spies come back. And so they told them, and they said, we went into the land that you sent us, and truly it flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified, very large. Moreover, we saw descendants of Anak there. And the Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, the Hittites and the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are able to overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. Now, again, at that point, probably all of that is totally accurate, but that never takes into account the fact that God is able to do, look what he did to the Egyptians, but they have forgotten that. Now, it says, and so they gave the children of Israel a bad report in the land, which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. And we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and we were as we were in their sight. Okay, great. So that's their report. Now, because of that, the reaction of the people, as we see there at chapter 14, verse 1, the people wept. They cried. Why? Fear? Or we're not going to be able to make it in? or all of those kind of things. And whatever the reaction that causes this, it is because once again, as they had done so often, they took their eyes off of the Lord and forgot his promises. And forgot that he makes promises, but that he also keeps them, and he is able. I mean, if the one who tells you to do something is able to split the Red Sea and have you walk through on dry land, he's pretty impressive, right? So taking care of a few giants here or there, I don't care if it's a whole nation filled with giants, it's not a problem. But they forgot that. Well, it says, now all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or only we had died in this wilderness. What a bunch of drama queens, right? Goodness gracious, what a sad thing. Okay, so let's remember again. Here's the reset, because there is great application to us as believers here. Because there are times when, yes, bless you, there are those times when even in our walk now, we may come up against circumstances, then we start to think, wouldn't it be better to just go back to what we used to do? That's the default, that's the easy thing, right? And I've watched people do it so many times. Whatever it is, they go through something and they get to that point is, what's the use? What's the use? Are you kidding me? We're talking heaven here. We're talking about walking rightly before God. And is that ever something that should be drawn into question? It's amazing to me. Well, if only we had done this. So is the woe is me. Put your hand to your forehead and your life is so difficult. Well, remember at this time of the spying out, had they followed what Joshua and Caleb had said, and they had become courageous like those people and said, you know what, you're right. You're right. And followed that counsel, they'd have been in the land. I'm going to ask you while I'm doing this, can somebody take a look and let's get that picture of them going through the wilderness, if you don't mind. So while they're looking for that, let's just go on. Verse 3 says, now why has the Lord brought us up to the land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should become victims? Would it not have been better for us to return to Egypt, or why don't we just return to Egypt? Now notice what he ends up doing. They, by their own cowardice, are going to set the parameters of their judgment. Because they're the ones who said, our kids, God's brought us out here. Wouldn't it have just been better if we all died? Now our kids are going to have to deal with this. Oh boy. And they are pronouncing upon themselves their own judgment. Well, so they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. Now they're going to challenge even the person of Moses and God himself. And the seeds are here planted. And you're going to find that this becomes something that happens more than once. So Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. But Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. Now this is just a way of that grief and mourning of what have we done? So here, Moses and Aaron, the people who have seen things that no one else has seen, because they've had that chance to be right there with the Lord, they are the ones who don't rebuke the people for their unbelief, but they get into the same place of, reaction and fear and all the rest of it. Notice the reaction of Joshua and Caleb, and that's like, this is the sign of mourning. This is the sign of tearing their clothes. It's the disgust, it's the sadness, it's the brokenness of these men, because they have said, this is the land that God gave to us, and here we're worried about who's the inhabitants when God is on our side. Are you kidding me? And this is that time that it's an outward grief. So they spoke to the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land that we passed through to spy out is exceedingly good. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into the land, and he will give it to us. It is a land which flows with milk and honey. Now, we are in the book of Numbers, chapter 14, but that phrase, the land that flows with milk and honey, it is not the first time that that's popped up. In fact, we're probably familiar with the term enough, but we might forget the very first time that it was ever mentioned. Do you want to see where it's mentioned for the first time? Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. Let's go there. Good reminder, because what it tells us is the promise itself goes back to the very beginning of this work of Moses. the very beginning, the burning bush. The burning bush. Okay. In chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." Now, this is after he slew one of the Egyptians, but after he escaped and before God had called him to do this thing that we know of Moses, right? The guy that, Charlton Heston. So, it's before all of that. Here's where he's just doing his shepherding thing. And now you see, and the angel of the Lord, verse 2, appeared to him in a flame of fire and in the midst of a bush. And so he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire. The bush was not consumed. That's how far back this goes. Take a look then at verse 8. "So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians," this is God speaking, "and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land that is flowing with milk and honey." You get it? That's how far back we're talking about it. To the very beginning of the call that God puts upon Moses to lead them to a land. Remember, he hadn't even gone back, and the people have not even made it out of their bondage yet. They haven't escaped. This is at the beginning. I'm going to send you back to have your contest with Pharaoh. That whole thing's going to have to take place. I'm going to get you across the Red Sea, and I'm going to take you all the way up and give you to a land that was promised to them all the way back to Abraham, but it's a land that flows with milk and honey. So there's your phrase. The first time that you see it is in verse 8 of chapter 3 of Exodus, at the very beginning of the call of Moses. That's how far this goes back. So Joshua and Caleb, back to Numbers, Joshua and Caleb, by using that phrase, are able to say, this is the land that was promised all the way back to what God had said to Moses back in chapter 3 of Exodus. Now, of course, they don't quote Exodus 3:8 because, no, that wasn't written by that time. So back here, you guys are not laughing at any of this stuff. So, at verse number 9, we get this. "Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." That is the first solid bit of anything that is said since their good report. Their report was totally correct. All of what has been said about the land and the inhabitants, fine, let that sit. Notice that they never disputed any of that. They just said, that's not the issue. We should go. The Lord is with us. And so they once again say this. Now, what's the reaction? Look at verse 9. It says, "Do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land. They are our bread. Their protection is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear." And the congregation said to them, or said, "Stone them with stones." That was their reaction. Before we read the rest, what they have said would have tipped the scale had everybody said, you're right. You're right. We got overwhelmed by the report, but yeah, let's go do all of this. Now, imagine if you could, when we are not equipped in our minds to really fully grasp the importance of what happens next, but you know that every time that God had something that he really wanted to get communicated to them, what would happen? His visible presence would descend, and that was conference time, right? Moses was going to the tent. That is no sooner said. Look, all the congregation said, "Stone them with stones." Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before the children of Israel. Uh-oh. God's got something to say. Okay, so that sets everything in motion for what we read next. So they go and spy the land. It's the one that was promised all the way back to Abraham. The 10 spies are filled with fear and unbelief. And so they give a report that is supposed to sway the people to let's look for an alternative, all the way to the point they said, let's just select somebody to lead us all the way back to our bondage. Amazing. Joshua and Caleb said, what are you guys talking about? My paraphrase. It is not for us to worry about who are the inhabitants. God is for us, so by definition, their protection has now left them. The people's reaction, kill these guys, and God shows up. Oh boy. So, before we read on, this is one of those verses, if ever you wonder, what is Chris going to be looking at in the video room of heaven? I want to go watch this. What's the reaction when everything happens and God descends? Verse 11. So the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? Notice who's being rejected here. God makes this an issue that they are in unbelief because their rejection of me. And how long will they not believe me? That's the essence of their problem. It's a lack of faith. It's a lack of belief. And he says this, as I've been pointing out all along, with all the signs which I have performed among them. So there's no excuse. It's not as though there's no track record here. God has said, with all the things that I have done, why are they still walking in this place of unbelief? And why are they still in this place of rejection? Notice what it says next. I will strike them with a pestilence and disinherit them. Oh my goodness. Now, these are not idle threats. God doesn't play that way. I'm sure that he knows what Moses, well, he obviously knows what Moses' reply is, but this really puts Moses to the place of leadership. And look at what he does. So Moses said to the Lord, when the Egyptians will hear of it, for by your might you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of that land, or this land. They have heard that you, Lord, are among the people, that you, Lord, are seen face to face, and that your cloud stands above them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill these people as one man, then the nations which you have heard, or which have heard rather, of your fame will speak, and here's what they will say. Because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land which he swore to give them, therefore he killed them in the wilderness. God was not able to complete the task. Now, some people would look at this and say, here is Moses trying to play on the sympathies of God, or trying to, make it in some way a challenge or whatever else. He knows not to worry about pretense because God's not put off by those kind of things. He understands what's going on. So it's not as though Moses could try to use some manipulative way of getting God to do something other than what he would do. This is genuinely him interceding, and it moves on the heart of God. Would he have made good on what he had said? Sure. He had no reason not to. He was completely within his rights to do it. And Moses' objection is valid. That's why I believe it's offered in the right kind of a heart. And so it really begins to, if you think about it, it really does put Moses in this place of intercessor, understanding the situation and doing rightly by saying, God, if you do that, it's not because of them, but look at how it reflects on you. And it doesn't play against God having some kind of weird pride issues and all the rest of that. He's God. He has no such things. But here Moses seems more concerned about the reputation, if you will, or how this reflects on God more so than the people. And so, again, because he's not going to be able to manipulate God into doing something. You'll see that by God's reply to this. Because the Lord was not able to bring the people out of the land, is what verse 16 said. And so now I pray, let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying, the Lord is long-suffering, abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and to the fourth generation. Do you realize what he does here? This is Exodus 34. This is when Moses gets the second set of tablets. And God says, let me tell you about myself. Those are God's words, and now here Moses repeats them back, not as a way of indictment or trying to force God. He's just saying, Lord, let it be as you have said, that you will show mercy, but you're not going to dismiss what the people have done here. Again, it's a wonderful thing that Moses does here, but it really kind of seals in what becomes his fate as well, because he seems to have fallen in with the bad report people. They're the ones that fell on their faces, where Joshua and Caleb are looking around as like, what's up with you guys? God told us to go. Let's go. That was not the reply of Moses and Aaron. Was theirs more of believing the unbelief, or was it the burden of trying to lead a people who were rebellious, or all the rest of it? Whatever it is, they fell into the problems that everybody else did, where Joshua and Caleb said, this is ridiculous, let's go. These guys, wow, how cool. Well, as we see this, he says, it goes on in verse 19, to pardon the iniquity of those people I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, as you have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. So if you want to look for this again, it's Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, where God says, let me describe myself to you. Where he says, again, verse 18, the Lord is long-suffering and abundant. Now, what you're going to see is when God says that, the very first real good example where this takes place of what was said by God there at the giving of the law is going to be played out in these people's lives. Because remember, the kids that are going to have to wander around in the wilderness, the youngest of them is going to be about 40 years old by the time that they go in. And then the children born to them are the ones that are going to go in. That's pretty amazing when you stop to think about it. And it will be that the iniquity of the parents is going to follow the children to the third and the fourth generation. Here's where you see it beginning to take place. This is the first example of where it happens. So, God is able to be merciful and all the rest of it, but he never looks the other way. He doesn't wink and nod at sin. He's no different now than he was then. So we can't talk about sinning with impunity and say, oh, grace, grace, and all the rest of it. Wait a minute. You may have to deal with the consequences of your actions. You can be forgiven, but you're going to deal with the consequences of your actions. And so, again, they're wandering, these people. God didn't strike them all down, though he could have and though he said he would, until Moses intercedes. Now, the 10 spies won't fare so well, but let's look at verse 20. So the Lord says, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly, as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, they have put me to test now these 10 times and have not heeded my voice. So, of course, the question comes up, what 10 incidents? They have probably had plenty to reference. Some people would say that it's God not being exact. He's just using it as like, well, a dozen times or whatever else. Here's what we know. It's said 10 times, but it doesn't give the specifics, so it's not for us to try to figure out. It is God saying, I believe it is 10 incidents that God was referring to. I personally believe that. I don't think God uses just hyperbole. I think he's just saying these 10 times, but he doesn't enumerate what they are, though he has plenty of opportunity. It's just not given to us in the text. So here's God saying, I have brought them out in miraculous form, and yet they continue to put me to the test. So, he says, they have not heeded my voice. They certainly shall not see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. Now, he says, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants will inherit it. Now he says this, as far as the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwell in the valley, tomorrow turn and move out into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. So here's your picture. Okay, so you get an idea of where this all is. They had to kind of do the about face and not go into the land where it is, because now they've got to start in that place of doing their wandering, because they can't go in on the direct route. God isn't going to make the way for them. So he says, now go by the way of the Red Sea. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long shall I bear with this evil congregation who complain against, who again? Against me. Now, of course, sometimes they would direct their anger towards Moses, and they're not done yet. By the time we get to chapter 16, they're in their next rebellion. Right? So what you have here is that their rejection is ultimately once again against me. Let's remember something here. It's kind of important. If we are the type who do like to witness to people and all the rest, and whenever we say something that we feel is really important and we get nothing but rejection, don't take it personally. Because it's not us that they reject. It's the Lord that they reject. It's your message. It's not you, the messenger. Unless you're like really obnoxious. So, if you bring a super soaker and say, I'm going to just, soak you if you don't listen to me, well, that might be a problem. Their rejection is ultimately going to be of the message and the person that you are there to represent. So don't take it personally. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will do to you. I'm sorry, I skipped a little bit of it. Verse 27, let me read it one more time. How long will I bear with this congregation who complain against me? I have heard the complaints which the children of Israel make against me. Has he brought us in the wilderness? Wouldn't it have been better for us to just go back to Egypt and all that stuff? That's all they're griping, right? So he says, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will do to you. You're going to die in the wilderness. Did God bring us all the way out here? Wouldn't it be better if we just died in Egypt or right out here in the wilderness? Instead, he's going to take us in and slaughter our kids. Okay. Just as you said, I'll let you be the one who casts your own judgment. Bless you. What is it with people sneezing tonight? Stop it, all of you. Verse 29, just kidding. The carcasses of you who have complained against me will fall in the wilderness. All of you who were numbered according to your entire number from 20 years old and above. Now, that tells you just how thorough this was. Really? Everybody believed that report? That's amazing. So it's like none of them got out, except, verse 30, except for Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. You shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. Now, he has already gotten to the point where he says, I'm just going to take them all out, Moses. Instead, because of intercession, these people are going to have to, they will not be put down right away, and they could have repented and all the rest. It's just not going to change the judgment that God has. Well, we see here, but your little ones, whom you said would be the victims, I will bring in, that they shall know the land which you have despised. Wow, what an indictment, huh? You've despised the promise, is probably more the way of saying it. Because if they had really held to the promise, they would have said, well, wait a minute. The land that they're telling us is going to wipe us out is the same one that God offered to us and said he was going to take us to it. In fact, one of the spies comes back and says, it's that land of milk and honey like God promised to Moses. And by the way, he promised it to Abraham, Isaac, and to the children, of which we are the number. Well, let's go. That should have been the reaction. Instead, no, God's brought us in here. He's going to wipe out our kids. Okay, great. You guys have just pronounced your own judgment. You're going to die in the wilderness, but your kids get to go in because you use them as an excuse. Wow. Okay. Now, verse 33, your sons will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years and bear the brunt of your infidelity until your carcasses are consumed in the wilderness. Remember, visiting the iniquity of the fathers to the third and the fourth generation from Exodus 34. Right here, you see it played out. If you've ever wondered, well, what does that mean? Because people talk about generational curses and all kinds of spiritual things. Here you have it. You're going to have to deal with the consequences. Your parents may be the ones that goofed up, and unfortunately, your kids are going to have to deal with it. Though they will ultimately get to go in, just think about even the youngest of them is going to be 40 years. And they're going to look back and say, gosh, I wish mom and dad had it together. I would have rather gone in at the beginning. Grown up in the land that God had given to us rather than going at 40 years old. Pretty heavy stuff, huh? Verse 34, according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you will bear your guilt for 1 year, namely 40 years you shall know my rejection. So why the 40 years? There you have it. The book of Numbers without math. How do you like that? So if you were wondering, why 40 years? Now you know. It's 1 year for every one of the days that the spies went in and brought back the bad report. So again, why the 70 years of the captivity in Babylon? Because for 70 cycles, they did not give the land rest like God told them to give it. So their time in the penalty box, 70 years in the Babylonian captivity. Why 40 years walking around the same mountain? Figuratively. 1 year for every day that they had a chance to see the land that they gave the bad report and fell into unbelief. Now, if you're those kids, or if you're Joshua and Caleb, thanks a lot, folks. You're keeping us out of the place of promise. And yet, if you think about it, the mercy of God is shown in that because God could have wiped out all of those people because of their unbelief. Instead, they had to deal with the consequences of that unbelief, but they lived. Now, verse 35 says, I, the Lord, have spoken this. I will surely do so to all of this evil congregation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness, they shall be consumed and they shall die. Wow, heavy consequence, huh? Now, the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation complain against him by bringing a bad report of the land, Those very men who brought the evil report about the land died by the plague before the Lord. Now, what plague is it? We don't know. But can you imagine, once again, there is a lot of God saying, let me teach you a lesson here. There are a lot of lessons being learned here. Can you wonder, or could you even imagine how long it would take to forget this one? The guys that came back, 2 of the 12, said, the land is, certainly it's a formidable thing, and the people and all the rest of it, they didn't dispute any of it. What they said is that God told us to go. They had the favor of seeing that God was going to see them into the land, saying they have a different spirit in them. What about the other 10 guys? They died of plague, whatever it was. They were killed to a man because they gave the report that led to a lack of belief and a crisis of faith on behalf of the people. Had all of the spies came back the same way, again, this is I don't see that there's a way to dispute this. Had they all said the exact same thing, there would have been no reason to judge them. The people wouldn't have responded the same way, or at least not all of them. Perhaps some of them would have said, yeah, but we're afraid of the report. Well, great, die here in the wilderness. The rest are going in. That's how that could have gone. However, it didn't. So it says in verse 38, but, so by contrast, Joshua the son of Nun, Caleb the son of Jephunneh remained alive, and the men who went to spy out, of the men who went to spy out the land. So those are the 2 that made it through. Now, again, another study in the hubris of man. God says all of this stuff, right? He says all of these things, and now people are looking for another way out. How foolish is this? So Moses told these words to all the children of Israel, and the people mourned greatly. If they had left it at that, that had been enough. Look at what they do. So they rose early in the morning, and they went up to the top of the mountain, saying, here we are, and we will go up to the place which the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. Okay, great. We recognize it, we're sorry, we goofed up, but we're going because now we believe. Well, all right, so Moses said, now why do you transgress the command of the Lord? For this will not succeed. Do not go up. Why? Lest you be defeated by your enemies, for the Lord is not among you. Wouldn't that be a horrible thing to hear? So people who have kept opening the door into their noses are about to try to do it again. And when Moses, the guy who has God's ear, says, hey, I'm not going with you. Don't go. God's not with you. That should have been enough. But typical humans, here we go, verse 43 rather. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites are there before you, and you shall fall by the sword, because you have turned away from the Lord. The Lord will not be with you. So what he has said is final as far as this is concerned. Just be happy you're not going to die on the spot here in the wilderness, but don't tempt him, because now you're going to go up against the very same people that you were fearful of after you've rejected the Lord. Now you're going to take matters into your own hands. Yet again, don't go. The Lord's not with you. So, verse 44, but they presumed to go up to the mountain. Nevertheless, neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed from the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in the mountains came down and attacked them and drove them back as far as Hormah. Bad idea. So it's compounding one mistake after another, after another, after another. Good thing for us to remember. If God says, do this or don't do that, and we walk in disobedience, and God tells us that things are going to be a particular way as we read in the Word, or if we just know that the Holy Spirit's leading us to do something, go with what you know. Don't take it into your own hands, especially as in this case here. God has said through Moses, don't do it. I'm not going with you. We're not going to do this in the normal progression of things, and if you go, it's going to be all over. And so they get routed. Now, that closes this particular chapter. Now, there are some, because there's such a radical change in the subject matter, people have thought that these things are all out of order and this really doesn't belong here and all the rest. That's not right. See, again, God has passed judgment because of their actions. What God does by going into what he does in chapter 15, it is for the people who walk by faith, or even for the kids that don't even understand what's going on. He's giving direction and said, when these people all die off during those 40 years, the day's going to come when the rest of you go in. So once you have gone in, And once you are then able to offer up and do the things that you're supposed to do, let's get back to the normal course of things. So God's speaking 40 years plus down the road. And it is as promise to those people who walked by faith with him. It's an amazing thing how God is able to say, all right, well, I've made my judgment, this is what's going to happen. Even after God had made his judgment, there were still people that put him to the test, and we see what happened to them. Now God is basically saying, okay, 40 years is how long you're going to be here. I've demonstrated that I'm not with you if you try to take matters into your own hands. Now, as you sojourn, the day will come when you come into the land, so let me give you preparation for that. It's God saying, look forward. So we have that in chapter 15. Now, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel. Next chapter, have you tell this to the people. And you say to them, when you have come into the land that you are to inhabit, which I am giving to you. Can you imagine being one of the people who fell into unbelief and then hear that? Wow. Look at what we failed to see. Look at what we failed to believe. And now look at the consequence of that. God is speaking to these people, and it's not our promise any longer. Now it's to the generation after us. Wow. When you come into the land that I am giving to you, and you make an offering by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering, or a sacrifice to fulfill a vow, or a free will offering, or in your appointed feasts to make a sweet aroma to the Lord from the herd and from the flock. Here's basically what he is saying. All the things that I have given for you to do, and these will be observances that will happen in their time in the wilderness, but God is saying, don't think that this is just for the wilderness. This is what you're to do when I finally bring you into the land after this time of judgment is over. It will be as in your own land you will do the things that go all the way back to the very beginning of the offerings of the law. So when you read through these things, they're pretty much the standard offerings, the peace offerings, the sin offerings, the trespass offerings, all the different offerings. He's saying when you get into the land, you're going to get back to doing these things as the normal course. So he says, so then he who presents, verse 4, his offering to the Lord shall bring a grain offering, 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil, and 1/4 of a hin of wine as a drink offering. You shall prepare with the burnt offering as a sacrifice for each lamb. Or for a ram you shall prepare as a grain offering 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/3 of a hin of oil, and as a drink offering you shall offer 1/3 of a hin of wine and a sweet aroma to the Lord. Now, before we read on any of the rest of this, just see the implication of this. First of all, I'm going to have to get you from where you are now to the place where you're supposed to have been all along. And when you do those things, here's what I want you to do. Do you not see that it is God saying, this is going to happen? It's not possibly when you get there. It is when you get there, this is what you will do. So the idea that they'll be in the land is a foregone conclusion. It's not even in debate any longer. It's just who's going to get there. So what he ends up saying is that you who have gone in, because of no fault of your own, you're going to have to walk around for 40 years. But when I bring you into the land, I'm asking you to be obedient and do the things that you're supposed to do. He's recalling to them the things that he had asked them to do at the beginning when he established the priesthood and the offering system that is there. He's reminding them, when you get there, you're going to do these things according to the law. So at verse 8 it says, and when you prepare a young bull as a burnt offering, or a sacrifice to fulfill a vow, or as a peace offering to the Lord, then shall be offered with the young bull a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/2 a hin of oil, and you shall bring as a drink offering 1/2 of a hin of wine, and as an offering made by fire, it is a sweet aroma to the Lord. And you can get all of this as you go back through Leviticus in particular. None of this is like they hadn't heard it before. This is a reminder. Here's how it's supposed to be done, and with such specifics. And why was it sweet smelling? You can go back and listen to the studies that we did on that. But there were the different offerings for the different reasons, and here is God saying we're going to get back onto the normal course. So, verse 10, you shall bring as a drink offering 1/2 a hin of wine, and as an offering made by fire a sweet aroma to the Lord. Thus, It shall be done for each young bull, for each ram, and for each lamb of your or young goat, according to the number that you prepare, so you shall do with everyone according to their number. All who are native born shall do these things in this manner, in presenting an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. Now notice how he switches it to this. Now, if a stranger dwells with you. So this is that reminder that there are those people who came out of the Egyptian captivity who are still with them. This is the idea of strangers, or those who may come in along the line. Now this is the important part. If a person is going to come in that may not be native of the tribes, it's not that God says you can't. It's if you're going to, you do it according to the prescription of the believer. Okay, same thing with now. When we talk to people, we say, look, you can identify as a Christian, you can come into this relationship, but just know this, that if you're going to do so, that you walk by the same requirements as every other believer. You have to believe the same things in common. People don't make it up as they go. So for those people that say that there are many roads to God, you've heard me say it a number of times, or some people will say all roads lead to heaven, or all roads lead to God, some variation thereof. It's okay for us to be able to say, well, it's partially true, but it's partially inaccurate. Everybody will see him face to face. He'll either be your judge or your savior. It's your choice. You pick. So there's an element of truth to that. We don't want to reject it out of hand, because the Bible tells me that at the name of Jesus, every knee bows and every tongue confesses that he's Lord. Okay, great. So we want to be able to say, you're going to stand before him someday. You just have to do it on his terms, not on your own. You can't make it up as you go. There's not many ways to come into heaven and be right before God. There is one way and one way only. Same thing is being said here. So what about the stranger? Well, what about the person that's not of the children of Israel? Great, he addresses them. It's basically the same prescription. So you come to him on his terms. So he says in verse 14, and if a stranger dwells with you, or whoever is among you throughout your generations, and would present an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord, just as you do, so shall he do. It's the same, because it's not about some identification with an ethnicity or with a type of people or anything else. It is about God made all of these people, and if they're going to walk with him, no matter where they came from, they do so according to his direction and his will, and you're not just born into something. You do so by faith and you walk accordingly. Now, verse 15 says, one ordinance shall be for you of the assembly and for the stranger who dwells with you, an ordinance forever throughout your generations. As you are, so shall the stranger be before the Lord. One law and one custom shall be for you and for the stranger who dwells with you. Again, I love that part because it shows that there's not an exclusivity as far as God is concerned. There aren't prerequisite qualifications. All can come to him no matter what. It is when they come to him, are they going to be obedient to what he's required? There's the issue. Paul picks up on that, does a great job of it, says that there's no distinction. Not Jew or Gentile, you know the whole thing. Rich, poor, free, slave, man, woman, all are one. Great. Nothing's changed. It's the same, in fact, even more so that as it is here, hey look, anybody is welcome to come in. They just have to do it in accordance with what I have required. As a Christian, it's like all have to come to Jesus. All have to be forgiven. There is no way to heaven by our own efforts. Okay. Verse 17. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I will bring you, then it will be when you eat of the bread of the land, and you shall offer up heave offering to the Lord. You shall offer a cake of the first of your ground meal. Now this is getting away from the animals. Now this is getting into the things that are produced. And so it will be that as you eat the bread of the land, verse 19, that you shall offer up a heave offering to the Lord, and you shall offer up a cake of the first of your ground meal as a heave offering of the threshing floor. You shall then offer it up. On the first of your ground meal, you shall give to the Lord a heave offering throughout your generations. If you sin unintentionally, now it gets into all the nuanced things. So it will be of the people and of the individual. There are those things that they do deliberately, and then those other times that they offend that's brought to them after the event. Here's what you do. If you sin unintentionally and do not observe all of the commandments which the Lord has spoken to Moses, all that the Lord has commanded you by the hand of Moses from the day that the Lord gave you commandment and onward throughout your generations, then it will be, if it is unintentionally committed, without the knowledge of the congregation, that the whole congregation shall offer one bull as a burnt offering, a sweet aroma to the Lord, with its grain offering, drink offering, according to its ordinance, and the one kid of the goat as a sin offering. So there is the things that you know full well that you've done, the things that were not done as an intended thing, yet still it is a sin. God makes provision for that. And it shows you, here again, in our world today, you have so many times people will say, well, there's the sins that are just really, really egregious, and other ones that are just like, oh, well, as though God takes a wink and a nod at such things. No, sin is sin. All sin and fall short of the glory of God, Paul tells us, and that wages of that sin is death. I don't care if you stole a pack of chiclets as a 5-year-old, that's still sin, and it's just as deadly as being murderous. Sin is sin. All sin disqualifies every single person from heaven. That's why we don't want to take the idea of putting price tags on sin. Sin is sin. Now, there are things that just offend the sensibilities, and there are things that are so offensive and they hurt people and all the rest of it, and those are just egregious in our sight. But let's just face it, sin is sin. It's all disqualifying. So, with that said, there is this idea of the unintentional. Well, verse 25. So the priests will make atonement for the whole congregation of the children of Israel, and it shall be forgiven them, for it was unintentional. And they shall bring their offering, an offering made by fire to the Lord, and their sin offering before the Lord for their unintended sin. Now, it shall be forgiven the whole congregation of the children of Israel, and the stranger who dwells among them, because all the people did it unintentionally. It goes on, and it says in verse 27, now if a person, now it's not just the general people as one, but the individual, same kind of a thing, the unintentional. If a person sins, the individual, unintentionally, then he will bring a female goat in its first year as a sin offering. So the priest will make atonement for that person who sins unintentionally. And when he sins unintentionally before the Lord to make atonement for him, it shall be forgiven him. You shall have one law for him who sins unintentionally, and for him who is native born among the children of Israel, for the stranger who dwells among them. So again, not two standards. One standard, all who come to him by faith, if sin enters in. Intentional, unintentional, all the same things, they still apply. Here's the interesting part. But the person who does anything presumptuously, that is, I know full well what I'm doing. I understand the consequences. I don't care. Right? We know those people in our day and age. They may have been to church. They may have read the Bible. Think about the people who, there was just a story I read this week. There was a guy who wrote a book like 10 years ago, and everybody thought it was great. It was Why I Kissed Off Dating or something like that. It was a thing about, he's not going to deal with dating anymore. His whole thing was, I'm just not going to do that whole scene. I'm going to find the woman that God has called me to, and it was that whole thing. How many of you guys know what I'm talking about? All right. So this guy writes his book, and it was really all the rage for a while. Wow, look at this. The idea of not going into the dating scene and waiting for the person that God is bringing you, if that's kind of the way that the book was written. Anyway, he finds the love of his life, gets married, he's pastoring a church and all the rest of it. He has now abandoned his faith entirely. Doesn't even identify as a Christian. He's divorced his wife, and now he's apologizing to all the people that he hurt because of his book. The gays and lesbians and all the rest, he's apologizing for all of it, and he has absolutely abandoned the faith. Wow, now that's a pretty amazing thing when you stop to think about it. What a profoundly sad thing to say. Well, with all of that said, the person sinning presumptuously. This is a guy who should know doing what you do has grave consequence. That is you thumbing your nose at God. Now, people, let them debate whether or not he was ever saved and all the rest of that. Whatever. Fight it out, folks. I'm not interested. I won't even watch you duke it out. I'll just turn around and walk the other direction. What I know is a guy who will do that, That is a person, those are the statements of a person who is not born again. That's a frightening position. They have, this person would at that point, now he has time to repent, God can fix all that, okay, great, have that debate as well. But here's a guy who presumptuously and intentionally mocks the very essence of salvation. Same thing that's being mentioned here, kind of a thing, though in the Old Testament. But of the person who does anything presumptuously, whether he is native born or a stranger, that one brings reproach to the Lord, and he shall be cut off from among the people. That's a reproach. I know what God said. I don't care. That's the presumptuousness. Doesn't matter whether he's of the children of Israel. Doesn't matter whether he's got the DNA or if he's just a stranger who's come in. That kind of presumptuous sin, verse 31, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment, that person will be completely cut off and his guilt will be upon him. He will have no one to blame but himself. Why? Because he knew full well what he was doing. This person, hypothetically who it is, and every once in a while we'll see him come onto the scene, even in our day and age, knowing so much more. Knowing the cost of salvation, that Jesus bled and died. It is incredible that people get to that point. But we see them from time to time and we just kind of, we scratch our head. Now, verses 32 to 36. When you read this, we can understand it. It's plain, simple English. We get it. It's not difficult to grasp and all the rest of it. But boy, oh boy, it is a hard one to stomach because of how serious it is. Look at what's said here. Now, while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation, and they put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. So here's the scenario. The guy knows he's not supposed to be engaging in what he's engaging in. He is breaking the Sabbath law. Doesn't seem like a big idea. I mean, he's just gathering sticks. Now, that's the excuse that one might be able to give about, well, what kind of justice should be pointed out to him? Again, this is the price tag. Oh, come on. He's just gathering sticks on the Sabbath. What's the big deal? Yeah, well, wait till you ask him after this gets done. Here's the issue. Did God tell you not to do this? Yes, it's a day of rest. Don't do anything that is work. Don't gather sticks. Well, what's going to happen? Slap on the wrist? Not hardly. We already know what's going to happen. Look at what God says. So the Lord said to Moses, this man surely is to be put to death. All the congregation will stone him with stones outside the camp. Not even in the midst. Take him outside of the camp and kill him. He just picked up sticks. What's the big deal? The big deal is God said, don't pick up sticks on the Sabbath. Because that's a day of consecration and separation to me. This is an example. Remember what we read this morning in 1 Corinthians chapter 10? Where we read there that Paul says, look, these things of their history, they are put there as examples to us. They are there for our admonition. So be careful if you think that you're standing and that you got it all figured out because your next step is going to stumble. Same thing here. What if God says, yeah, it's no big deal. He's just picking up sticks. Let him pass. What about the next person that says, well, I want to pick up sticks and this, because God will be gracious. This is the sometimes thing that we get even in the churches today, that we wink and nod at little things. It's not that serious. Really? It caused Jesus to die. Don't tell me it's not serious. If God says no, no means no. Do you really need to have the consequences meted out on you for that? Okay, you can have that, but that's just foolishness. So this guy says, now remember, this would not be an offense that would be unintentional. Remember? This is presumptuous sin, and immediately after God says that, we have an example of a presumptuous sin. So what's an example of a presumptuous sin? Well, thanks for asking, because you have it right here in the text. How about picking up sticks on the Sabbath? Seems like a minor offense. Not for this guy. Verse 36, so the Lord commanded Moses, and all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. What do you think about the next guy that on the following Sabbath said, I think I'll go out and pick up sticks today? You think they'll remember what happened to the guy the week before? Again, these things are intended to say, don't play games. When God says something, he means it. And if a person is going to say, let me see if I can push the envelope and the boundaries, just know that this may end up costing you your life because you're putting him to the test. God said no, no means no. There needs to be consequences. Parents, those of you who have children, let your yes be yes, let your no be no. If your kids hear you say no and they think that it's just idle threats, you're to blame. Let the consequences be the consequences every time, just the way that they're supposed to be. You are not your kids' friends. You are your kids' parents. Wait until they're adults to be friends. But when they're kids, they need direction. Here you have a great example of it. Be firm, be loving, be just, be all of those things, but be consistent. Here is consistency. Again, it wasn't a slap on the wrist because God said, you break the Sabbath, you die. It was just sticks. All right, tell that to the guy that picked up the sticks. Verse 37. So again, the Lord spoke to Moses. And he said, speak to the children of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels in the corners. And you shall have the tassel that you may look upon it and remember all of the commandments of the Lord and to do them, and that they may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined. Ooh, boy, what an indictment. Now, you still see a remnant of this, and I love it when we're in Israel. Sometimes you'll see these little tassels that come out from the garments, especially of the guys. And those little tassels are part of their prayer shawls. So it is, again, an application of this, but let's just make it for this right here. This would be that when you see it on your own garments, and you would certainly see it on everybody else's, it is to be a reminder to you. All that God has done, all of his commandments, his faithfulness. It's to be a constant reminder. And remember, God has already done this with them. We read this back or we'll see it in chapter 6 when we get to Deuteronomy, of the things that were supposed to be a reminder to them. What we hear in the Shema, Hear, O Israel. And the things that would be done of God telling, let this be a reminder to you. So we get the phylacteries, and we get the things bound to their hands, and we get the mezuzahs on the wall. All these things that are to be this visual reminder. And then all of the oral things that would happen thereafter, that they would talk about these things. Same kind of a deal. When you see these tassels, these fringes, these little pieces coming off the corners of the garments, it is for them to be a reminder, look at what God has done. It's a visual thing at all times to keep them in a place of always coming back to the same understanding. Only people that are part of the covenant would even have these types of garments. And every time that you see them, you would be reminded, the God who led us out of Egypt, the God who has spared us even in our unbelief. So for 40 years, think about that, looking around. Yeah, it's a reminder that God spared us. It's also a reminder to us of everything, even our own disobedience. Wow. Imagine that, having that kind of reminder at all times. Well, verse 40 says, and that you may remember and do all of the commandments and be holy for your God. Be set apart. Let it be a reminder to you. Let it be a call to your holiness. Let it be a reminder of all that he has done. Having it like that, again, what a cool thing. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. Now, let's remember something in this that's really, really interesting. Chapter 14 is tragic for so many reasons, as we've seen. Chapter 15 says, when I bring you into the land. So looking forward 40 years. In your time that's here, there is the idea of saying the intentional, the unintentional, the presumptuous sin. Then he gives you the example of the man who sins on the Sabbath. But then notice what he says. Even though you're going to have to walk with the consequences of a judgment, I want you to be reminded of my grace. I want you to be reminded of my mercy. I want you to be reminded of my covenant to you. I want you to be reminded of everything that's taken place. Even in your sojourn, even because you're having to deal with the consequence, I still want it to be a reminder of my presence among you and the things that I've done. Let it be a reminder to you. It is still a promise going forward, even though they have had to deal with the consequences of their own sin here and now. It'll be a reminder to you that I'm still with you. Pretty good, isn't it? Love those chapters. Now, you'd figure, okay, great. Now they got it together. Yeah, well, next week we have communion. The week after that, we've got Korah. Oh, goodness. All right, so how many of you guys know the whole story of Korah? Oh, you're about to find out. So I won't even do that. You can read ahead, or you can do the whole thing about, well, Chris said that we're going to figure out why 40 years. Now you're going to find out why sometimes the ground will open up and swallow people. It's not funny, is it? Let's stand and let's have a closing word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much again for your word. We're grateful for the instruction that we can get from it. We recognize that we are not people that are under the law, and yet at the same time, you're the God who is the same. All of the things of the law were to teach us obedience. There were many things that we can learn from this. That when you give instruction, we are to be obedient. We do know, God, that you do not wink and nod at sin, that there is consequence for every action. We thank you that in the eternal sense, that we are saved by an act of your grace, by faith. We know that the things that we do in this life, they may very well affect us for the rest of our lives. And at the same time, we know that you are the God who is abundant in mercy. We thank you for your long suffering, for your patience with us. We thank you that we are able to learn of who you are through your history, how you've dealt with people through the ages. We thank you for what we can learn from the scriptures. We ask that you'd be glorified in our lives. May we be holy and separate to you. We thank you and give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen.